Okay. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So, yes, I am Gary Wainwright from DEFRA. I'm currently leading up the service transformation arm of the Biosecurity Borders and Trade programme, which my main focus at the moment is to get the new borders target operating model finalised, working with Cabinet Office to get it published so that you guys can all see the detail and we can have a better engagement on it. So I'm not starting with an apology, but I do have to say that obviously there are things that we're trying to finalise right now that I won't be able to go into great detail on, but I'm going to talk you through where we've got to and kind of what's coming next. So I think just to kind of recap, as was said in the introduction, it was in April of last year when ministers decided that the import controls that we were planning to introduce on EU goods, EU SPS goods from July of last year wouldn't actually be introduced. And there were a number of factors that played into that decision, but that decision was made and we were asked at that point to develop a new target operating model for the border. So something that would look different to the regime that we were about to introduce, which was essentially the regime that we'd inherited from the EU. So every department, DEFRA included, was asked to, every department that's got an interest in the border was asked to develop a set of options and policy thinking around how we could implement a regime that will be a single regime that would apply globally. So not just a regime for how we introduce checks on goods coming in from the EU, but actually how we introduce a global regime for imports from across the globe, from all our trading partners, but also to strike that balance between minimising where we can any new burdens on businesses, but actually safeguarding biosecurity. So our main aim within DEFRA is to think about how do we ensure we protect the biosecurity of the nation, but how do we actually implement a regime that does strike that balance effectively. So the new target operating model that we talk about now will introduce proportionate controls at the border, as we term it. So much more based on an assessment of risk. So not a blanket approach, but actually thinking about what are the things that we really are concerned about. And also giving ourselves a window of opportunity to think about how can we make better use of technology to automate process and make sure we're doing everything we can to digitise services wherever absolutely possible. So the target operating model does cover imports and exports, but essentially we focus from a DEFRA perspective, we focus primarily on how do we make the imports regime on SPS goods as good as it possibly can be. So the sort of DEFRA mantra bit on why do these controls matter. So what we're trying to do really is avoid some fairly significant impacts. So we're trying to avoid diseases entering the country that could devastate parts of UK industry. So we talk about African swine fever quite a lot at the moment. So an outbreak of that, which is actually happening in some parts of the EU at the moment and is spreading closer and closer to our borders, that could actually be a disaster for farmers across our country, and it could also really undermine consumer faith in the quality of our food. We talk quite a lot about foot and mouth outbreak. Remember the cost of that to the British economy and what that did back in 2001, and how African swine fever it puts the pig industry at real great risk if it does come into the country. And then there's also the sense of the consequences or the impact that can have on us as an exporting nation as well. So other countries look at our level of biosecurity and use that as it's a precondition to accepting our exports. So it's really, really important from an exports perspective. So as well as talking about protecting, we talk about animal, plant and human health, which is really, really important from a biosecurity perspective. It's also there's an economic impact to this as well. And as I mentioned with the African swine flu example, there are, swine fever should I say, example, there are certain diseases and pests that are spreading across the EU, and we want to make sure that we can sort of prevent that incursion into Great Britain. So just back to some of the principles that we then looked at for the target operating model. So we want to design a really modern border, and we want it to be a simple and effective system for biosecurity controls. We want it to be global. We want it to be evidenced on risk. We want it to be risk-based, We want it to apply to all trading partners. We want it to be more proportionate and targeted than the model that I mentioned we inherited from the EU. We're going to look at how we can digitise certification, so sanitary and phytosanitary certification for imports and exports, so that's across animals, animal products, plants and plant products, as our trade partners are ready for that as well. So obviously digital certification is very much a two-way thing. And we're looking at opportunities to integrate our DEFRA services with external systems as well, so with trader systems, for example, so that we can enable sort of auto-population of data with our services so that we can avoid the burden of keying lots and lots of data in. And I'll touch on single trade window as well later, which I think you heard a little bit about that this morning. And also we're trying to simplify wherever we can the paperwork. So export health certificates for imports are being simplified right now. We're thinking about how can we reduce them down in terms of the number of fields, and for some of them, we think we can make significant areas where we can simplify process. So those are our sort of key principles around the TOM and how it will be different to what we would have introduced in July of last year. So just to give you, there's a page on plants and plant products and then a page on animals and animal products. There's a lot of similarities actually between the two, but just some nuance across the two of them, I guess. So we talk very much about that dynamic risk categorization based on the inherent risk in the actual commodity itself, but also combining that with the country of origin and really coming up with that sort of dynamic risk assessment based on commodity and country of origin. And the check rates will then be determined by that categorization. So it's understanding the level of risk and then it's applying a proportionate treatment strategy to each of those risks, rather than, as I said earlier, this kind of blanket approach to checking all SPS goods as they come in. From a plant's perspective, there's an opportunity to actually deregulate certain goods that we recognise pose a really negligible risk. So we're looking at that as well. And the authorised operator status, some of you may be aware of that. So we're looking at a number of ways that we can understand how we can trust certain businesses to move checks away from the border, I guess, and undertake checks in a different way. So the authorised operator status, for example, that would allow a private operator to carry out their own import checks. So if they meet certain standards and criteria, they can undertake checks at a designated premises away from the border. So we talk about like trust and trusted trader schemes. This is kind of a plant's version of how can we start to introduce those types of things. And digital certification, mentioned earlier, so we talk about e-phytos, so phytosanitary certificates in a digital format, and being able to consume a digital certificate and trying where we can to automate and take paper out of processes, integrating with external systems to speed up processes. And all of this is also linked to our thinking about how do we integrate all of this with the single trade window, which you heard about earlier in the day. So how can we make sure that we can create a user experience and a user journey through the single trade window for SPS imports to avoid that scenario where people are having to go and input data that DEFRA needs into this service over here and data that another government department needs in that service over there. So we're working really closely with the single trade window to design how all that will look in the future as well. Yeah, there's probably not a lot of difference on this slide maybe. So from I'll try and pick out some of the differences from an animal and animal products perspective. It's the same idea, this dynamic risking, this sense of being really clear on the risk level and the treatment strategy. Trusted trader schemes, again, a slightly different scheme that we're looking to design for animals and animal products, which is about reducing or removing checks where we can be assured that certain companies can provide an equivalent level of checking and assurance in a biosecure way inland at their own facilities. The simplification of certificates I've mentioned earlier, which is just like how can we reduce down the number of fields required and reduce that burden and amount of information that's needed there. And digital certification, all sorts of opportunities to streamline processes if we can receive data in that digital way, and then we can utilise that data and clone that data to pre-populate systems and services and not ask for the same thing twice. So that's where we are with kind of where we're thinking of heading with animal products. And that's kind of a summary really of the whole sort of, we talk about digitisation as one of our sort of key design principles. So being able to receive data in digital formats, being able to use that data to automate process, that integration with external systems wherever we can, integration with the single trade window. So those are the sort of key design principles for the target operating model. In terms of, you may know where things are up to, you may have been engaged in conversation that has been taking place. So I know Cabinet Office do drive stakeholder engagement calls to keep people up to speed with what's happening with the target operating model. I can't share any more information about dates of when different things will land and when we'll be expecting to introduce new controls, but the target operating model itself is going through its kind of final stages now of getting our ministerial teams briefed, pulling together draft products that will explain the target operating model in more detail, and then eventually through Cabinet Office publishing a draft target operating model that will be then followed by a period of engagement with industry partners, where you'll be given a chance to sort of review that, come back with feedback and questions, and that's coming all, I imagine, in the next few weeks. So yeah, it would have been great actually to come today, and say a week or so ago the target operating model had been published out there, because we could have had a richer probably conversation about some of your feedback, I guess, and your initial views. But that's just a timing thing, I guess, just a little bit unlucky that it's worked this way around. So yeah, so that's the update from DEFRA in terms of the target operating model. Anyone got any questions?
Thank you. Yeah, a lot of our members are involved with that Cabinet Office engagement. From what I understand, I haven't been involved. It is pretty good. It seems to be sort of quite comprehensive. A lot of guys, a question that was put to me, I don't know how true it is. It's something I'm not really involved in, but the feeling is that there's a lot more focus on exports, because the European Union is a hell of a lot stricter than what we are, and imports are being ignored to an extent. Is there any comment that you would have on that? Is it something? Mm-hmm.
Yes, I guess the situation that we've found ourselves in is that we're having to comply with requirements for exports already, aren't we? So they've been introduced already, and yeah, the opposite effect hasn't taken place yet in terms of the imports regime. I guess some of this comes down to the situation we found ourselves in last year, where we were ministers decided that it wasn't the right time to introduce those controls, and yeah, I guess there were a number of factors that went into that decision at the time, which has meant that we still don't have those import controls, but yeah, hopefully the target operating model will resolve that for us.
Anyone else have questions? I promised we won't ask about Northern Ireland. Okay.
I indeed have a question, but I missed out the joke in my presentation because a German trader told me, no joke, the UK government should indicate deadlines without naming a year. Okay, so this was just a quotation. The real question is, whilst there is kind of an international standardization or harmonization in the phytosanitary sector, with the veterinary health certificate, there's a lot of bilateral understanding. So how do you manage then that electronic certificates are really accepted? Because we see in trade practice what happens, country A issues electronically, sometimes even a non-manipulation one that you need to validate a certificate, and country B, even maybe Germany here, does simply not accept. So how do you, when you go digital, secure that traders then don't end up with, let's say, the wrong format?
Yeah.
Or are you just more flexible than Germany and the EU?
Yeah, so you're right. There's a common approach, common standard, isn't there, for plants, and there's the international hub and all that's already there and working really well. And you're right that we do have to think about it almost on a a trading partner by trading partner basis in terms of how we're going to do this digital exchange of certification. So it isn't, you know, it's not without its complexities, definitely, but we're already thinking about how we can do some of that exchange with EU member states. But just before Christmas, we trialled an exchange of import certification with New Zealand, and that's worked, and that's now up in full operation. So if we're importing from New Zealand, we can now use that digital certification. We can clone the data into our iPath system from that digital certificate, and we can pre-populate data with an iPath based on that information. But you're right, then we need to then look at what are the differences and things that would need to overcome to ensure that that is not just going to be something you can just roll out globally. You need to go on a country by country basis and work out how we're going to actually do this data exchange. So it's not simple or straightforward, but we're designing that now.
I was just going to ask, how do you capture if there was, say, a contaminant coming into the food chain? So what kind of reporting system do you kind of endeavour to capture that so that obviously we're all nice and safe, but it can happen before it crosses border?
Yeah. So I think that's one of the key things that we're trying to introduce in the regime is that we have border control posts where we bring goods in for physical checks, and we have experts, as we do now for goods coming in from the rest of the world, and we have experts at the border in border control posts checking consignments and identifying any risks and not letting consignments in that may be containing a risk. Sorry, come on.
Sorry, I was more concerned with, do you remember years ago, sorry, I was thinking about years ago when we had this kind of regime where people were actually walking into kind of places and injecting poisons into meat. They were quite radical, but is there kind of that kind of reporting that kind of says, look, we've seen something that's really shouldn't be happening, and that someone's reporting that kind of incident, rather than, you know, I appreciate a border, you're doing your checks as normal, but what's capturing the kind of radical kind of actions that get taken place, you know, the anti kind of, you know, people that want to impose some kind of damage to others in an unsafe way. How do we check that? Yeah.
So I don't know, actually, is my honest answer to that, but I can definitely take it away unless Angela can come and bail me out on that one. But we can definitely take that away and have a look at it.
I'd say the FSA probably got some link with the Food Standards Agency as well.
Yeah.
Link into that. Sorry, I was going to say the Food Standards Agency are going to have some kind of link into that surveillance kind of piece as well. But no, I can take it away and get a bit more of a definitive answer on that.
Yeah, we can talk to our colleagues in Food Standards Agency and come back on it. We're focused on how do we do checks at the border, but it's a really good question, and we'll come back on it for sure.
Yeah, look, any questions like that we will take from the audience, feed them through to you guys.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very, very much. I mean, that was really important.